The Brazilian suffered from the variety of bombs and gunfire that the Russians launched against him, trying to destroy his most sacred moments. From coffee to the precious minutes when he had to act quickly to save the lives of his brothers in arms. In the trenches of Ukraine, where Portuguese with a Brazilian accent echoed among laughter and supplies, the combat medic fired at faces, saw the enemies just a few meters away, and launched 40mm grenades and 5.45 ammunition at them. In the end, corpses paved a road of death over the soil of the Kraken-BR forest. The Brazilian used his medical knowledge to make sure that neither his body nor those of his companions became part of the landscape of the dead covering the land. The man goes through different battles, all of them putting his one and most precious possession to the test. The human being's war for survival carries with it the paradox of the meaning of that word. Many times life is worth little or nothing to some, but it remains a unique and irreducible value. There is no return from a lost life except in memories tinged with mourning and longing. There is no way to reduce it without extinguishing it to a memory, whether it is sweet, bitter, or a mix of sensations flavored by the history of people. War makes the paradox of life more poignant since its premise is the death of the other based on false or true justifications that only try to give noble veneers to aggression. Nothing demonstrates this better than flags often false that seek to nullify the value of life. The refusal to accept this null value moved a Brazilian at various moments of his existence, until it made him stop in the middle of a forest with a needle in his hand, trying to find the blood vessels of a comrade, while above them the drones hovered ready to descend in a final explosion. The cameras recorded the tense moment, becoming proof that amid so many explosions, life still made sense in the souls of some. It was a testimony that there was still hope in certain values, in case one day it was published by the surviving Brazilian or by the attacking enemies, who had so often released videos of the last moments of fallen fighters. Diego Rebonato, codename Spirit, had a long history before setting foot in the forests of Kraken-BR in Ukraine. At 39 years old, he carried the experience of different battles in life. He spent 6 years as a soldier in the Brazilian army. He was on the border with Paraguay, working as a paramedic between 2004 and 2010. In the first year of that period, he already received the medal for Most Distinguished Enlisted Soldier. During that time, his calling grew. He graduated as a nurse in Paraná and went on to do a postgraduate degree in São Paulo, which placed him as an intensive care specialist in major hospitals for many years. It was more than a decade forging this calling that prepared him for difficult moments in 2020 when he faced his first war. It started with rumors, fear, and then a rise in personal tragedies, in which an invisible and silent agent gradually stole the breath of thousands. The COVID-19 epidemic put Spirit's anxiety and experience to the test. It was a time when the scythe of death came almost silently, revealing itself only through the labored breathing of a chest struggling for air. A thin, high-pitched wheeze escaped from the throat with each exhalation of the hospitalized patient, like wind filtering through a narrow crack. The sound of the machines meant either hope or the end of another life. They were intense nights, with the spirit being hammered hard as hearts finally stopped. And it was up to the nurse to inform up to 10 families a day about the passing of their relatives. Time went by, with Diego Rebonato's soul forged in the understanding of what responsibility meant and the ecstasy of having the ability to save a life. At the same time having to deal with the fact of failing in that mission, The war against the virus passed, but the calling stirred up turmoil inside the Brazilian, which led him to set foot in Ukraine in October of 2023. Diego Rebonato had already visited almost 24 countries when he arrived in the land of a nation involved in one of the worst recent conflicts in human history. It was a matter of choice and calling to be there after so many experiences. He signed the contract with the International Legion of Ukraine. This military unit was created on February 27, 2022 by the Ukrainian president 3 days after the Russian invasion. The goal was to formalize the entry of foreign volunteers who would be incorporated into the Ukrainian armed forces. Spirit was fully accepted in the 2nd Battalion, where many soldiers from Latin America were already fighting. With weapons and uniforms in hand, he was sent to Charlie Company, where many Brazilians were already fighting on one of the worst fronts of the war, the Svatov-Kramina axis in Luhansk. Kramina, located in the west of Luhansk, was much less famous in the news than other combat centers, like Donetsk. Less mentioned doesn't mean less violent. The pine forests were already suffering from the devastation of the war when Spirit arrived. Tantes Russos removed the soil and grass on the way to the firing position. The gears of the automatic system moved to feed the shots. The cannon of the T-72 fired the shells toward the Ukrainian positions. They exploded, knocking down even more trees that covered the holes where the defenders were taking shelter. Ukrainians and foreigners from the International Legion squeezed into the trenches, rushing to escape the brutality that was falling upon them. Spirit was one of those men moving through the trench, hearing the violence screaming against his life. While many were seeking shelter, the Brazilian was running, putting on his procedure gloves. His focus was to survive until he reached another living being. It didn't matter if nearby or anywhere else in the forest, the tanks were still blowing up trees in an attempt to bring down the Ukrainians together. Spirit's goal was to reach one of his comrades to provide medical support. The nurses' training was a blessing for those providing care during the shelling. Charlie Company, with so many Brazilians, was happy to have him there, helping and still having the patience to give instructions. The work didn't end with just a few bandages. They were just a temporary measure to get the wounded onto a stretcher and carry him through the forest. From above, Russian drones observed the movement. They clearly saw it was a medical team. That made them even more aggressive. Their bombs came down through the forest, hunting anyone who could patch up soldiers, to the point of putting them back on the front lines. Spirit walked alongside the men carrying the stretcher, hoping the Russians wouldn't interrupt his process of saving one more life. That was the routine for the Brazilian in Ukraine. He already knew what he was getting into after watching so many videos at that stage of the war. It was the moment when the bombs exploded, cutting through the cold winds that had started to blow to prepare them for winter. Spirit was glad to join other Brazilians, meeting Commander Aquaman, a former soldier of the Brazilian army. Other compatriots were part of that team, forming a cohesive group that reinforced the region's defenses. They were not alone in the terror of the fire forest. The 63rd Mechanized Brigade supported Charlie Company, trying to spread the flames over the Russian positions with all possible fury. The impacts of the munitions struck many parts of the forest with force, devouring the lives of Moscow's men. These strikes were important as support, but they were nowhere near what the Russians were capable of doing with their artillery. Sometimes the Russian fire was so intense that it destroyed all the cover and trees, leaving the soldiers fighting for Kiev completely exposed. The trenches offered little protection when the explosion tore through the air among them, covering some bodies with dirt and sending pieces of corpses flying through the air. One lucky survivor still ran away, but with the chance of being pursued by drones. The Russian tank entered areas like this, completely devastated by artillery, where even parts of the trenches lost their depth when the ground was churned up by bombs. The cannon broke what was left of the trees. Pieces of stone and remnants of the forest's rich soil filled the air. The Russian soldiers got out of the armored vehicle on one of the flanks of the trench. By that point, there were few Ukrainians left defending the place. They had to walk slowly. Among these troops were soldiers from the 331st Guards Airborne Regiment, part of the 98th Airborne Division. There were also motorized rifle brigades, such as the 35th and the 55th. Of course, the Storm Z battalions couldn't be left out, which became so prominent in 2023 after the withdrawal of the Wagner Group from Ukraine. Thus, some of Kyiv's positions were lost near Kreminna. But the position held by the Brazilians did not meet the same fate. The Charles Company stood firm amid so much pressure. It wasn't for lack of fire on those positions. The forest in front of Spirit was lit up by the brutal lights of Russian artillery. The explosions were the constant companion of every soldier inside Kreminna. There he came afterward with his blue moons making his way through the trench covered in dust raised by the impacts. He ran between the craters, dodging the debris until he found another wounded man. The blood didn't scare him. Maybe the possibility of losing another comrade did, but the fear of loss poisons all reasoning. Therefore, Spirit focused on the best he could provide under the circumstances he was in. The world didn't stop during any of those treatments. There were no clean rooms, lab coats, or specialized help. Spirit relied on other soldiers willing to risk themselves and become targets by staying still, trying to help someone who was wounded. All a drone pilot or artillery operators wanted was a stationary soldier to target. Sometimes the artillery would go silent. It seemed like the Russians forgot about that devastated land. You could even think about having a coffee. Even in the quieter moments, that is, without the sound of artillery, things were still tense in the forest. The Russians were there in the middle of the woods, preparing some kind of plan. Like, for example, interrupting a Brazilian's rest and coffee break with a few explosions. Their RPGs started flying toward the trench. They had a lot of ammunition to use against Charlie Company. The rocket-propelled grenade is a rocket-propelled grenade launcher. The soldier loaded the ammunition, rested it on his shoulder, and pulled the trigger to launch the projectile with the hollow charge warhead. It could usually be carried by a single soldier and could be used against armored vehicles. The rocket, propelled by a motor, was stabilized by fins. The impacts exploded in the direction of the Ukrainian defenses. The Russians took advantage of the time they had outside the trench to shoot as much as possible. Spirit wasn't hit by a rocket-propelled grenade, and that day, with his coffee in hand, it could have been that it wasn't even those Russians striking the forest at the spot where he was. But the fact is that there were people attacking the Brazilians' trench at the wrong time.
My coffee, son of a bitch!
And nobody messes with a Brazilian's hot coffee. The Russians had different strategies to start an assault on a trench. Their favorite was to use heavy artillery to shatter the defenders' morale, in case their lives hadn't already been torn apart. But there was also the use of RPGs or drones. After that, the squaw soldiers could move, launching an offensive against a trench that might have even lost part of its structure, depending on what had been fired at it. The Russian AKs fired their rounds in search of the lives of men who had decided to go to Ukraine with no ties to the land, but with a connection to ideals. An ideal gives a man a different kind of strength, just like when someone messes with his coffee. Diego Rebonato was a combat medic, and the word combat was in his soul. His leaders tried to hold him back because of his valuable training on the battlefield, but eventually they gave up. Maybe understanding that the Russians had crossed a complicated line on Coffee Day. His comrade handed him the rifle with an attached grenade launcher, and inside the bunker, Spirit aimed at the bears running between the trees. The shot was so precise that it drew a laugh inside the shelter. The retaliation against the bears filled him with adrenaline. His finger mashed the rifle's trigger. The Automat Kalashnikova. 34 fired with a sound muffled by the silencer, but perfectly in tune with the symphony of death. That was not the time to save lives. It was time to shoot. Spirit put the Automat Kalashnikova on the ground and picked up the rifle with the grenade launcher already loaded again. He went to take another position. The Symphony of War has many instruments. Diego knew the music of some of them very well, making their sounds heard by the Russians in the forest. The RPGs he fired flew toward Moscow's forces on the other side. They exploded among the trees, breaking the momentum of the Russian advances. It was important not to give the enemy any space. The RPGs had to fly. Without those explosions or the crack of rifles echoing through the forest, the bears would gain courage in their advance. Suppressing the enemy was crucial to ensure that the rocket-propelled grenade operator had time to unleash his devastating punishment. The sound of the explosion among the desperate bears excited the men. Many times the soldiers from Moscow were so close that their shapes stood out before Spirit's eyes. The 40mm grenade launcher joined the cacophony of war, spreading even more chaos in the enemy's advance. His comrades kept up the suppression while he reloaded. Teamwork provided the calm needed to grab the ammunition, load it into the launcher, and aim again. The 40mm grenade exploded with a dry bang, shattering the air in a storm of metal shrapnel. Sharp fragments spread in all directions, tearing through a deadly 5-meter radius and carrying pain up to 15 meters beyond. The shockwave swept through the area like an unspeakable punch, brutal and crushing. The Automat Kalashnikova 74 sang more in those days. Spirit unleashed verbal insults and lead against the enemies in the middle of the forest. At least some of them shook the Russians. Bodies of fallen men were heard. They were so close to the trench that they could hinder the defenders' movements. Not to mention what the accumulation of corpses would cause in terms of smell and flies. The combat work didn't end when the rifles started to cool down. Spirit didn't stop for a second in the forest. He didn't just serve Charlie company. Rebonato walked through the trees. The tension of moving between them made his heart leap in his chest, in rhythm with the thunder of the Russian bombs. Hearing the whistle of a mortar made his hair stand on end. The whole world was a threat outside the trench. Drones and bombs traveling through the sky, Russians hidden among the trees, mines and traps on the ground. Carrying a fallen man between the trenches was risky. The threat loomed in the sky, surely watching them. If the Russians didn't shoot at that moment, it was because they didn't have anything ready yet. Far away, surely the soldiers from Moscow began to set their machines in motion to break the defenders at that delicate moment. The paratroopers from Ivanovo from the 98th Airborne Division, for example, put the 2B9 and Vasilik mortars into action. The team made the calculations quickly, using the drones as a basis to locate the enemies. An 82mm mortar fired up to 100 rounds per minute in the forest. It was this kind of threat that Spirit faced already inside the bunker, trying to replenish the lost fluids of an injured man. Hypovolemic resuscitation is essential. Much of the soldier's blood had spilled onto the ground in the forest. Spirit needed to restore the circulating blood volume after a major blood loss. Even with bombs exploding overhead, he tried to focus on providing care. Without replacement, losing so much fluid could cause a critical drop in blood volume, resulting in low blood pressure, less oxygenation of tissues, and risk of organ failure. The snow fell on so many trees and bodies lying in the forest. The cold froze the ground and tried to dampen the soldiers' spirits. Diego's automat Kalashnikova 74 did not rest under the white veil. It heated the air, vibrating in the Brazilian's hands as he fired at the Russians. The rifle did its job during the winter. On the other side, the Russians launched their explosives. Both sides knew that simply standing still in the trench was not an option. An inert man attracted death, which saw him as the prototype of a corpse just waiting for the moment to take his soul. Spirit risked himself outside the trench to suppress the enemy with rocket-propelled grenade fire. The boots scraped the snow, the steady hand aimed the rifle at the Russians. The K-74 worked to distract the enemy. Even better if the distraction put some lead fragments inside their bodies. These exits from the trench needed to be quick. The haste, along with the snow, sometimes led to painful falls. But fortunately, the main victim in this case was the camera. The Russians warmed up the forest with large explosions. That heat reached Spirit and his companions in several ways. Moscow had an effective repertoire to break its enemies. One of them was the TOS-1. Mounted on the chassis of a T-72 or T-90 tank, this multiple rocket launcher had 24 tubes to fire its munitions. The munitions with thermobaric warheads sucked up the oxygen, turning the air into pure fire in the forest. The care for our comrades continued throughout all these attacks. The world exploded all around. The war wanted to feed on more lives, but Spirit fought to deny it its daily meal. The Russians tried several times to interrupt his rescues, but Spirit replied to them that today would not be the day the hungry dog of war would be fed with the soul of another from Charlie Company. Of course, Moscow kept trying. Gas grenades fell near the trench. The smoke quickly spread among the holes, entering the bunkers and saturating the men's lungs. The radio warned everyone to take care. They had to act quickly, putting on their masks and passing the message to their comrades. During those long months, he was under bombardment. Millions of dollars rained down on Charlie Company's bunkers. There wasn't much to do except look for cover and hope not to get hit directly. Winter passed, the summer heat came, and the routine continued. Bombs, blood, gunpowder, bandages. These months weighed heavily on his chest with the loss of friends, the suffering of daily life, and the exhaustion of combat. But he also brought home medals of honor and glory, and a war veteran medal, along with the feeling of a duty fulfilled together with a brotherhood that cannot be recreated anywhere else. Diego Rebonato left the trench to return to Brazil after 11 months of service in the International Legion of Ukraine. Promoted to junior sergeant for his actions in Kremina, he walked among the trees, seeing the remains of rockets, missiles, and bombs that had been dropped on him. So much was launched to wipe out the Brazilians in the middle of those trenches with no concern for anything except taking those positions. In the midst of so many weapons launched against Charlie Company, it seemed that the cheapest one was made of flesh and bone. It was the only one that was truly missed and that would have someone waiting for its return after being lent out to be in that forest for whatever reason. The remains of the weapon that was once alive but now rotting before him made the Spirit take a deep breath, seeing what was once an enemy now materialized in the rotten form of the legacy that war left behind. Aware of what conflict was, conscious of his reasons for being there and of his work, he only mourned for the lives that didn't understand the meaning of a soldier and the life of another.
May God have mercy on those who do not know why they fight. Shall we continue?